I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 18.4, the focus questions, where we look at the Allies and how they turn the war. We'll be looking at an all-out or total war. We'll understand how the nations were beginning to commit all of their resources to fighting World War II. We'll explain how the Allies began to push back the Axis powers in Europe and the Pacific. We'll describe the Normandy beach landings and the Allied advance towards Germany. You can see here a propaganda poster. These are really popular during both World War I and World War II. You can see the Allied soldier beginning to push back the Nazis, kick their Axis, the Nazi symbol there, hit Fritz, which was a slang term for a German or a Nazi, where it hurts. She's doing it. She's doing her part. How about you? Okay, let's take a look at question number one. How is World War One? How is World War II a total war? All citizens were mobilizing for war, either on the war or home front. Women worked in previously male-dominated industries, took over family farms and businesses. And women were really instrumental behind the scenes in terms of getting everything done on the home front. So if you think about America helping to win the war on the home front, it was certainly because of women. Citizens were asked to conserve. Even you as an individual, let's say you were a teenager back in the time of World War II, you might have been asked to make sacrifices, not complain maybe to your parents because you're not getting the same food item you really like, or the clothing, or the consumer product that you might want it. You know, if a war is going on today and you're in a similar situation, let's say you want the new iPhone or whatever it might be, well, you wouldn't get that necessarily during the time of a world war because things are being produced for the war effort, communication radios, things like that, electronics that'll help out in the war. And you have to kind of wait on those new electronic items. Another option that you had to really help out on the home front was to buy a war bond. A war bond works as follows. Let's say you buy a $50 war bond. Well, you would pay $30 for the $50 war bond, let's say in 1941. And then 10 years from then, you would get $50 back. So it would kind of mature to a full rate. And the varying cost on the $50 bond would be anywhere from $25 to $30. So that would be an investment in the country, but also an investment for yourself, as you will get paid back with interest a significant amount eventually down the road. Two, how did World War II impact the Great Depression? Well, mobilization and the increased production for the war wiped out unemployment in the United States and around the world, thus ending the Great Depression. Three, how was business restructured on the Allied home fronts in order to support the war effort? And I alluded to this a moment ago. It's a matter of supply and demand in winning the war. Fewer non-essential goods were produced. Without the demand for non-essential items and the need for weapons and war machines, manufacturing turned to producing assets for the war, such as tanks, aircraft, artillery, electronics, uniforms. Extra food was produced to be sent to the different war fronts as well. Millions of factory workers had to leave their jobs as well. So once again, women and even some retired workers, a lot of African Americans who might not have received those jobs too, began to get hired. So you did see a restructuring of those who were working during that period of time. Next, we're going to look at the infograph here. This is World War II GDP compared to aircraft and tank production from 1939 to 1945 to kind of gain some insight in terms of how the production for the war impacted the economy. Remember, GDP means the gross domestic product, the total amount of goods produced in a country on an annual basis. It's a good way to compare countries too. So you can see there the total GDP of the United States, 1939 and 1945, $8.5 billion. German, Soviet Union, UK, and Japan were all significantly lower. You can see the significance of American aircraft production as well, and tank production. 60,000 on the tank side and over 300,000 on the aircraft side, almost an unbelievable number. So looking at the question, which is based, and this is question number 4, where I review the infograph showing the GDP for each country and the amount spent on certain resources for a war effort. Compare each for the country, which we already did. What does the show in terms of GDP of each country during this period of time versus the production of tanks and airplanes? So there's a direct correlation then, because we were producing such large numbers of tanks and aircraft for the war effort. Quite obviously, this had a positive impact on the GDP. Five, how were individual rights and freedoms of citizens infringed upon during World War II? Well, there's a lot of censorship. You couldn't really speak out against the war, and this was true both in World War I and World War II. We looked a little bit at the propaganda poster. And Japanese American citizens in particular faced harsh rules and regulations in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor bombings. The United States and even the military and the government kind of collectively blamed all Japanese in general, not specifically just the Japanese military who attacked us at Pearl Harbor. 6, how do you think U.S. military leaders view Japanese Americans? As I mentioned, they had no distinction between the Japanese in Japan and Japanese American citizens in the United States. The American government, the American public, they were all enemies. There were also rumors that were beginning to spread, and you often have this when you have a group that's being targeted within a country. There were rumors about Japanese Americans going in, strapping bombs to their bodies, suicide bombers going to stores, schools, restaurants, etc., to blow themselves up, to kill as many Americans as possible. That never turned out to be true. 7, what order did President Roosevelt issue in response to the so-called threat from Japanese Americans? Now, a president has a way to kind of work around Congress instead of getting full support of the Congress. President Roosevelt acted, in his words, in the best interest of the United States and in the safety of our citizens by enacting executive order. And executive order is just the power of the president to unilaterally pass legislation. So Executive Order 9066 authorized military officials to exclude, basically round up, any and all persons from areas designated military zones. Under such orders, the Japanese on the West Coast, including American citizens of Japanese descent, were to be evacuated, basically rounded up and confined into internment camps. 110,000 or more Japanese Americans spent up to 3 years in internment camps. And you can see some of the imagery below. This is a prejudice sign here, again, anti-Japanese sign there in someone's neighborhood. Japanese keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. The middle image here is an actual poster that was hung up on telephone poles and police stations and post offices and town halls across the West Coast. And this provided comprehensive instructions for Japanese citizens to surrender to military authority. They were then put onto buses or trains, and they were taken to camps like you see on the right side here, where they waited in the long lines to get checked in. And they lived in fenced-in internment camps. It did not look all that different than a traditional Japanese concentration camp. They were heavily guarded, had restrictive movements, all of which was wrong in regard to the sake of history. Next, we'll look at Rosie the Riveter, who's portrayed in this image here. It's kind of like an iconic and perhaps the most famous propaganda poster of any era is Rosie the Riveter. She was symbolic of women who were strong enough, and you can see her there flexing her muscles, and determined enough to step up during the war to work in previously male-dominated industries. It was based on a real person. She, along with countless millions of women, stepped up during the war, putting forth the idea that women were just as equal as men, and in some cases even superior in terms of some of the craftsmanship and some of the different things they did during the war effort. Number 9, where's the Coral Sea located? What were the results? Why was the Battle of the Coral Sea a unique battle? What was its impact? The Coral Sea is in the South Pacific off the northeastern coast of Australia. In 2 significant days of fighting on May 7th and 8th of 1942 near New Guinea, an American naval force stopped a Japanese fleet that was advancing towards Australia. This is a unique battle that was fought entirely by planes launched by aircraft carriers. The victory ended Japan's goal of taking Australia and helped to build confidence for the Allies fighting in the Pacific. So we'll take a look at the map here so you get a better imagery. So you can see here, Yorktown is one of the ships we had. We had Lexington. So you see a lot of things named after famous events in American history. See the Coral Sea here. Coral Sea is located just off the coast of Australia. Cairns, Australia is where the Great Barrier Reef is located. A great place to visit. You can see the ongoing fighting here. And so this fighting was kind of unique because they're basically launching planes off of the aircraft carriers or attacking each other. There's dogfights in the air. So it was a unique battle as it was the only battle that was completely fought basically just on water. Another big battle in the Pacific would be the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway is a significant battle. Midway Island is located approximately midway between North America and Asia, not too far from Hawaii. And as the Japanese were attacking us at Midway, their goal was to secure Midway and then move on to a secondary attack on Hawaii. One in 1942, a little less than a year after the Pearl Harbor attack, would have been a follow-up attack to actually secure and take control of Hawaii from the United States. Okay, so as you look at number 10, it's kind of a long-winded answer here, so you can kind of summarize it for yourself as best you can. There's also a major motion picture that came out on Midway not too long ago, so if you do have any interest in World War II and want to watch a fairly decent film that does a pretty good job historically accuracy-wise on the Battle of Midway. So in June 1942, United States codebreakers deciphered Japanese naval code. U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz got word of the attack and reinforced Midway with planes and aircraft carriers. During most of the day, the Japanese planes had gotten the best of the United States forces. Fighting had seemed to come to an end for the day. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were refueling. So basically an aircraft carrier, we should have had an image up here for you, but very long ships, they have 20 or 30 airplanes on top deck, and they have to refuel the planes, the ship, get everything ready to go for the next day's fighting, and they do that, when they're done fighting for the day. So you have all these fuel lines being attached to the planes. United States warplanes, which had gotten off course a little bit during the day's fighting, a little disoriented, they were actually heading back to the American base, but were surprised to come across 4 Japanese aircraft carriers with fuel lines attached. They're basically sitting ducks because the combination of the American armaments and bombs and the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers' fuel created a nightmare scenario for the Japanese and an opportunity for the United States. They destroyed 3 of the aircraft carriers that evening. The other 4th was destroyed the next day. Over 3,000 Japanese men lost their lives. The Battle of Midway, and it's a key thing to understand why it's bolded out, is the turning point in the Pacific, thus ending Japanese advance in the Pacific. So basically, we stopped them dead in their tracks here, and then they're going to begin to retreat backwards towards Japan. Instead of, had they won Midway, they would have moved towards Hawaii. And what's after Hawaii? Most likely attacks along the west coast of the United States, and it could have been, even if we ended up winning the war anyway, there could have been significant damage to the west coast of the United States, fatality levels, especially high for American civilians along the west coast. 11, who were the big 3 Allied leaders during World War II, and what did they agree to early on? Okay, we'll look at the imagery here and go from left to right. The big 3 included British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Seated at center is American President Franklin Roosevelt. Here to the right side in the full uniform is Soviet leader Premier Joseph Stalin. And they agreed early on they would finish off the fight in Europe first before turning their efforts towards Asia. So basically the Pacific front would be secondary in nature, and the key thing to be done at that point in time was just for allies to kind of tread water in the Pacific. And then eventually, once we win the war in Europe, we could concentrate efforts in the Pacific. What request did Stalin make at the Tehran conference in Iran in late 1943? Stalin convinced the Allies to accept the Soviet-created borders in Poland. Stalin also demanded that Allies begin a second front in Europe as quickly as possible. His hope was that we got into Western Europe to fight the Germans, that could draw some of the fighters out of the Eastern Front. 13, what was going on in North Africa as the United States entered the war? The British were getting hammered as the German general Erwin the Desert Fox Rommel was putting a pretty good beat down on the Allies in North Africa. He was threatening to take control of all of Northern Africa, including Egypt and the Suez Canal. 14, what happened at the Battle of El Alamein in Northern Africa? The British, under leadership of General Bernard Montgomery, finally began holding their own and pushing Rommel's troops back a little bit, but could not get them to surrender. It's kind of like a stalemate initially. And then 2 U.S. generals, as we look at number 15, arrived in Morocco to help coordinate an attack at Casablanca, Morocco versus the Germans. These were American generals Dwight David Eisenhower, and he was also the commander of all Allied forces during World War II, and one of the great American generals of all time, General George Patton. So the American generals began pushing the Germans from the west eastward, and the Montgomery forces from the area of Egypt moved from the east westward, and then doing like kind of a vice move. And we're going to see this a couple of times during World War II, so they could take out the German forces. We'll look at 16 and 17 collectively together. So what happened in North Africa by May 13th, 1943? The Germans surrendered as the Allies won the first front in the war. This was a turning point in the North African front. And you can see this is where El Alamein is located, in this area here. And so we began pushing in this direction here with the British. We came in from Casablanca, Morocco, and began pushing in this direction here. And eventually they finished them off at El Alamein, which is in Northern Africa. And then the forces would then move. Where do the Allies go next after the victory in North Africa, which is 17 in July 1943? You can see here they're moving from the victory at El Alamein. The combined British and American force landed in Sicily, in southern Italy, with the goal of moving into all of Italy and taking control of the Italian front. 18, what were the results of fighting in Italy? Italians lost and agreed to an armistice. Mussolini was overthrown because of the failures here in World War II. He was imprisoned in Italy, and actually his friend and ally Adolf Hitler did a dramatic rescue, basically almost like a commando rescue, kind of pulled Mussolini out. The Germans helped resist in Italy for another 18 months, but eventually they were pushed out of Italy as well. 19, what was Hitler's strategy to take control of the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union? He ordered his forces to crush the Soviet Union in a quick campaign. Obviously, if you get dragged down in a long battle in the Soviet Union, that could be detrimental as the winter sets in. He hoped his blitzkrieg tactics would prove so successful as they did in the past, and the Soviet Union would surrender. Why was Hitler's strategic decision to try to take over the oil fields in the Caucasus region of the Soviet Union a disaster? The Germans fell short of the oil field goals and became stuck in a bitter winter in the Soviet Union, just outside of Stalingrad, and ended up fighting house to house, door to door. To gain even a block, it would take weeks, and in the midst of masses of soldiers on both sides, many Soviet civilians were killed as well. The Soviet leadership under Stalin, they kind of viewed their citizens as disposable, as to their soldiers, so therefore they didn't really care that much as to what was going on. The Germans, they ended up becoming trapped within the city of Stalingrad, and fresh supplies of food and munitions were not forthcoming from Germany. 21, explain the results of the Battle of Stalingrad. Well, the city was in ruins, but the Russians continued to fight back hand to hand amid the ruins of the city. In November 1942, the Red Army struck back with everything they had. The battle lasted into the harsh Soviet winter. And on February 2nd, 1943, after the Germans got stuck there in the winter, German troops surrendered. 300,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. 400,000 Soviets died in the battle, but it proved to be another bold for you, the turning point in the Eastern Front and the war. The German eastward advance in Europe was halted for good and proved that the Soviet Union was a force now to be reckoned with. '22, in order to pave the way for the invasion of D-Day, what preliminary steps did Dwight Eisenhower take on the Western Front to distract and weaken Germany? Eisenhower's strategy included Allied bombings of French and German infrastructure instead of just military targets. The Allies used long-range heavy artillery carrying B-24 bombers, began to demolish French bridges and railroads. Unfortunately, France took a good brunt of the damage just because the Germans had occupied France, and so that's where the enemy was located. This helped to hinder the transport of German weapons, machinery, and food supplies. In addition, they bombed German war factories and aircraft so that the German planes would be disabled from being used against the Allied forces in a potential D-Day invasion at Normandy. 23, what was a code name for the proposed invasion of France? Operation Overlord. What impacted General Eisenhower's decision to invade Normandy Beach, France in early June 1944? Well, if you're crossing over the English Channel, which is what they were doing, the weather forecast, tides, conditions, things like that, all had to be right because what they were doing was an amphibious invasion of Normandy Beach, meaning a water landing. 25, what was at General Eisenhower's disposal as he got set to invade the Western Front in France at Normandy Beach? 7,000 ships, which would carry 100,000 men and some 10,000 aircraft, all waiting for an attack order. One of the few dates in history you should be familiar with, June 6, 1944. Eisenhower invaded a 60-mile stretch of beaches in Normandy Beach, France. The invasion became known as the D-Day invasion. Right, so you have to envision Great Britain on the other side here. So Britain's here, so they're coming across the English Channel. You have Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, all of which were different spots that they were designed to hit. You had here not only the American troops who were invading, which we kind of cover more so as a country, obviously American heroes here first, but we also had a significant contribution from both the British and the Canadians, who had divisions that were deployed along the coast as well. Why were the Germans caught by surprise with the D-Day invasion? Well, the Germans had believed the invasion would occur a little bit further north, where the English Channel was narrower. In addition, the weather leading up to the attack was not great. The weather was so bad that General Rommel, who was in charge of German forces in France, went home for his wife's birthday, certain that an invasion was not coming. Of course, Hitler's not going to be happy when the invasion comes, and Rommel's not ready for it. I mentioned the amphibious landing. So you can see here the troops basically had to wade in water as they, the kind of the back end of the amphibious landing craft opened up, and they had to wade to the water, get to the beach, and obviously the Germans were up on the higher land up here firing down on the American and Allied troops. On the right side there is just a lot of different stats and figures there. 2,000 bombers, a bunch of different aircraft, things like that. '28, how many casualties were suffered during the D-Day invasion? Despite over 10,000 casualties, all landing beaches were secure by the end of D-Day. So it was a difficult and costly decision to attack. But by the end of the day, the beach was secure. For the next 3 weeks, the Allies landed another 1 million troops, tons of equipment, food, and supplies at Normandy Beach, France. What had happened by August 25th, 1944? American and Free French forces had liberated Paris. A provisional government was set up under French leader Charles de Gaulle, kind of a great figure in French history. By mid-September, the Allies had control of most of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. So now the forces are going to start moving towards Germany. What happened at the Battle of the Bulge? The Allies seemed to be marching straight towards Berlin when German military leaders decided to concentrate their forces towards the center of the Allied line, and they kind of busted through at the Battle of the Bulge. This is the final offensive effort of World War II. The Germans had sent the majority of their remaining forces into the center of the Allied lines. The result of their attack was a 50-mile bulge in the Allied forces, hence the nickname of the battle. And as the Germans advanced, they pushed Allied forces all the way back into Belgium. However, German success was short-lived, as after a couple of weeks, German forces were driven backwards, with the Allies back in control of the Western Front. By early 1945, it seemed German defeat was all but certain. 31, explain the conflicting ideas that came out of the Yalta Conference meeting in February 1945. Stalin demanded the Soviet Union have control of Eastern Europe to serve as a buffer zone against Western aggression. FDR and Churchill advocated self-determination, which would allow for all nations to determine the source of government that they would have. The three leaders agreed to a temporary division of Germany into 4 occupied zones after World War II. The United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France would each control one of the 4 zones in Germany to make sure that Germany would not get aggressive again. And then finally, the lesson reflection, fill in the graphic organizer, the 3 main fronts of World War II, 1942 to 1943. So we have the different fronts here. I'll talk about them individually. I give you a little more time in case you need anything for 31. So we have the Pacific Campaign. You have the Allies, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, the Axis under Tojo. The Battle of Midway, and after German turning points was the Battle of Midway, as we mentioned earlier. After Germany surrendered, they focused all their efforts on stopping Japan, working together collectively. They were able to surround Japan and give the Japanese the option to surrender. And when they did not, we had to use the atomic bombs to finally win the Pacific Front. North Africa, Allies, Churchill, Roosevelt, Axis, Hitler, Mussolini. Defeating the Germans in North Africa provided a way for the Allies to invade Southern Europe. We hit Italy after that point in time and began moving into other parts of Europe. Soviet Union or Eastern Front. Stalin, Hitler. Hitler launched his attack on the Soviet Union, lost, and the Soviets were able to push the weakened German army back towards Germany. And of course, the Western Front we just mentioned, primarily here in this particular lesson. Okay, so when you move forward into the next lesson, we'll see the fighting move on to the Pacific, and we'll see the ultimate end of World War II. Hopefully you enjoyed this lesson. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.